West Coast, who's joined us by video, and good afternoon to those here in the Brooke Mondale Auditorium. Happy Fair Housing Month. Okay. Thank you for being here to help us commemorate the 47th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And I am delighted to have our first class of AFFH trainees here in Washington to join us. My job right now is to introduce our national anthem singer from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, Mr. Bruce Bailey. Bruce?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight for the ramparts we watched was so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bomb bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Good afternoon. Let's give another round of applause to Bruce Bailey for that terrific performance. Great job, Bruce. Welcome, everyone, to this year's Fair Housing Month kickoff program. It has been 47 years since President Johnson signed into law the Fair Housing Act, one of the most significant achievements of the civil rights movement, and one of our democracy's most critical laws that provide all Americans with individual choice and fairness with respect to one of human beings' most basic rights, a place to call home. The Fair Housing Act became law 3 years after HUD was founded. As many of you know, HUD celebrates 50 years this year. And shortly after the famous report by the Kerner Commission, which outlined the vast inequalities our country was experiencing. The Fair Housing Act became law also 3 years after the March on Selma. President Obama and Secretary Castro were part of the 50th anniversary of the march a few weeks ago, and the president spoke there about the tremendous progress we have made in our society during the last 50 years. But he also reminded us that the march is not yet over. It is not over for us here at HUD, where we are charged with protecting our civil rights in housing through the work of the office I am so honored to lead, in cooperation with offices and programs across the department, and in close working partnership with other federal entities such as the Justice Department and local partners and communities across the country. So first I want to say today thank you to our fair housing partners and advocates for the great work. Some of them are with us today. Thank you to the HUD staff who worked in other program areas for being here or watching us via webcast. It really takes an entire agency working as one HUD when it comes to creating sustainable, and inclusive communities. And of course, thank you to the staff of the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity here in DC and across the nation. We, the leaders and principals, are only as good as the folks in the field on the ground let us be. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity this afternoon to have here Secretary Julian Castro. Secretary Castro is undeniably committed to the work of FHEO and to furthering the goals of creating fair and inclusive communities as a way to level the playing field for everyone. And I remind him that when he says HOT is the Department of Opportunity, I remind him that there is only one office that has opportunity in its name. We have a terrific speaker with us today. I am so honored that she accepted. I will be introducing her in a few minutes. But let me first say that this April, as I travel throughout the country commemorating Fair Housing Month, I will be talking about the decisive steps we are taking to combat unlawful discrimination in housing and obtain adequate relief for victims. Of the nearly 8,500 complaints HUD and its partner agencies received last year, of which 94% were resolved, this resulted in almost $33 million in compensations for victims and victims' funds. This includes cases involving women who were denied mortgages because they were pregnant or on maternity leave. This involves persons with disabilities who were denied accessible housing, individuals who were denied housing because of their nationality or because they don't speak English, and families who were discriminated because they have children. But this month, I will be also talking about proactive measures that we can take working in concert with local jurisdictions and that have become success stories in many parts of our country. Proactive steps that create the appropriate conditions to have a level playing field, one where everyone has an equal shot at freedom of choice and social mobility. And that is why the work underway to assist communities in their efforts to affirmatively further fair housing are so critical this year. So I invite you to follow the Secretary and I on Twitter throughout the month and share your thoughts on ways to further advance fair housing across the nation. Finally, you've noticed some of the posters, the rotator on the screens highlighting the ads that we are releasing for the first time to the public as part of our 2015 national media campaign. The campaign is being conducted by the National Fair Housing Alliance, one of our strongest partners in the fight against housing discrimination. And these ads have three broad messages. The first is that HUD is committed to creating, the first one, to creating thriving communities where everyone has the same opportunity to succeed. The second is that no one should be denied the chance to purchase or refinance a home because of his or her membership in one of the protected trades covered by the Fair Housing Act, an ad about lending discrimination. And the third is that discrimination against persons with disabilities has no place in America today. You will be seeing these messages throughout social media and media outlets across the country, and you are welcome to download these ads on our website. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our ally, our friend, our partner in the battle to end housing discrimination. We are very lucky to have him with us today. Let's give a big hand to Secretary Julian Castro.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Gustavo, for the introduction and for your spectacular work at FHEO. Gustavo has just done a spectacular job, and I've had the privilege of witnessing that over these first 8 months of my tenure. I also want to thank the entire FHEO team. Raise your hand if you're out there. All right. Let's give it up for FHEO. And I want to thank Assistant Attorney General Gupta for being here and for the important work that you and DOJ do every day to give life to the Fair Housing Act and to be our great partners in this. Thank you for your efforts. And to everyone here in the audience, happy Fair Housing Month. It's good to get to celebrate it with y'all on this April 1st. This is no April Fool's. And the folks know that as much as we celebrate today, really it's serious business. I did have the opportunity a few weeks ago to be one of many folks in the audience as President Obama spoke in front of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate 50 years since Bloody Sunday. After his speech, in the 10 seconds that I had a chance to speak briefly with the president, I told him that I thought that that speech was the most inspiring speech that he has given as President of the United States. In his speech, he spoke to the challenges that we've seen over the last 50 years, beginning with Selma and the civil rights movement that followed it, challenges of changing laws, of changing hearts and minds. And he also made the point, though, that we would be remiss to not acknowledge the progress that we have made in those 50 years, because we truly have come a long way. The Fair Housing Act came to life in 1968, shortly after Dr. King's assassination. And at the time, it was, and it still is, a landmark piece of legislation meant to ensure that everyone in this country has the opportunity to find a home without the obstacle of discrimination. It made it illegal to discriminate in housing transactions based on race, color, national origin, religion, and later the act would be amended to include sex, familial status, and disability. What we know, though, is that the words on a page are powerful, but they're also limited. It takes the work of folks like our FHEO team and the staff at Department of Justice and people all around the country to breathe life into those words and to make those protections real. We've come a long way in these past 47 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed, but we know that, as President Obama also said, there is still a long way to go. For instance, we know that we've seen studies showing that Hispanic and African American and Asian renters are about 10% less likely, or are shown 10% less properties when they go out there into the rental housing market. Same thing with folks who seek to buy a home. We see, when we look at America's neighborhoods, still concentrations of poverty and concentrations of the same group or groups of people. We see attitudes that, even though they have come a long way in 50 years, sometimes still persist. And the work that is done on a daily basis by our Fair Housing Office, contracting with nonprofits to go send out testers, taking in complaints and making sure that those complaints are addressed, oftentimes working with the folks who are on the other end of that complaint to ensure that policies are improved. And little by little, that housing market is opened up. That is the tough, day by day, but practical and impactful work that is making a difference. A sea change to what we saw in 1968 versus what we see today, and even more so, what we want to see in the future. You know, I have a daughter who is 6 years old. She just turned 6. And about a year ago, my mother, who used to be in the old Chicano movement of the late 1960s and 70s, so you can imagine she's quite liberal. She got her this book, and the book is called Separate is Never Equal, and it's a children's book. It's a children's representation of the old Mendez versus Westminster case that began to desegregate California schools. And when I got it as a parent, I didn't know quite what to make of it, whether I should actually read. I read the book myself, but whether I should present that to a 5-year-old child, because it's strong stuff about the past, and you never know how your kid is going to take that. At the same time, you want to prepare children for what they might possibly encounter in the future. And the beauty of our work is that we're working with so many other Americans to make sure that this next generation, whether it's in the context of schools or of jobs or of housing, that these young people don't have to experience what generations before had to experience, and that they can see an America that truly is colorblind and one where everyone can prosper and have a great piece of the American dream. So as you work toward that, and we recognize it during Fair Housing Month, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much for that. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for those thoughtful remarks about the work being done by my office and how important our efforts are to HUD's larger mission. Folks, our keynote speaker for today's program, Vanita Gupta, Acting Assistant Attorney General, is no stranger to civil rights. Her first case as an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund involved leading an effort to win the release of 40 African Americans in Tulia, Texas, who had been convicted on charges and sentenced to years in prison. All of the defendants were ultimately pardoned by Governor Rick Perry, and she helped to negotiate a $6 million settlement for the defendants. It was one of the highest profile cases of racial injustice in years, and established her reputation as being a trailblazer on civil rights issues. Even Hollywood took note and has decided, at least that's what we hear the plan is, to make a movie about the case. You know, a lot of us talk about who would play us in a movie about our lives. Vanita has the unusual benefit of actually knowing. We hear that the plan continues to be for Halle Berry in the role. That's very impressive. In her new position with the Department of Justice, she is responsible for directing how the agency proceeds in federal investigations surrounding events such as the recent shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, and other high-profile cases that will no doubt shape the course of civil rights in our nation for the years to come. And of course, this involves litigating housing discrimination cases in federal court under the Fair Housing Act, many of which originate here at HUD in partnership with the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity and the Office of the General Counsel. Thank you, Vanita, for the great relationship between our offices, and I know that under your leadership, this partnership will only become stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vanita Gupta, Acting Assistant Attorney General.
Brian and I have been friends for a little while, and he's in trouble for I think, introducing Gustavo to some of those introductory remarks. But thank you so much. I'm really, really, truly honored to be here, to have been invited today to speak. And I want to thank Secretary Castro for his incredible leadership on these issues. I've been a great admirer of his accomplishments, of his commitment to ensuring equal opportunity for all Americans. I also want to thank Brian and Assistant Secretary Velasquez for the invitation to speak here today, and to all of the FHEO staff and HUD staff that are here. The partnership between the Justice Department and HUD is very, very strong. We cannot do this without each other, and it is really a privilege to be here today to speak with all of you, and happy Fair Housing Month. I'm really grateful also to speak about the the work that the Civil Rights Division does alongside HUD, and to really celebrate the Fair Housing Act today. It is a very important time to do so. Recent events have no doubt thrown a spotlight on the racial divisions that cut into far too many communities around this country. And the topic of civil rights has really shifted once again into the center of a national conversation. And the issue of fair housing must be a very prominent part of that conversation. Fair housing, as all of you know, determines much more than whether a family has shelter. Fair housing is about equal access to good jobs, to schools, to credit, to transportation, to safety, and to a whole range of opportunities and relationships that really make up the bread and butter of what it means to live. And the Fair Housing Act puts the weight of that responsibility on the shoulders of our two departments. It is our job together to ensure that not only that housing discrimination does not force any families into the cold, but also that every family has equal access to two of the most basic rights of American democracy: equal opportunity and equal justice. Now, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act into law in 1968, he proudly explained that he was codifying the promises of a century. And our job is to follow through on those promises. Through persistent and even-handed enforcement of the Fair Housing Act over these last decades, we have rooted out discrimination and upheld basic civil rights for those who live in America, often our most marginalized members of our most vulnerable communities. We have made great strides forward, and we certainly are closer to realizing our nation's most fundamental commitments to equality, to dignity, and to freedom. But our presence here, as the Secretary said, as the Assistant Secretary has said, here today is not just about a celebration of the passage of the Fair Housing Act and the progress that we've made since. It really has to be an occasion to recommit ourselves to securing real, unfettered choices in housing, to the revitalization of our most vulnerable neighborhoods, to increasing access to credit, to breaking down the vestiges of segregation, and to opening the doors of integration. We must ensure that these promises of the last century continue to have real meaning in people's lives in the century to come. Because of our great strides, despite what have been remarkable achievements, it is all too clear that the challenges to fair housing endure. As President Johnson warned, the roots of injustice run deep, and racial barriers continue to divide our communities. Eligibility for apartments, houses, and mortgages continue to be influenced by where we were born, by the color of our skin, by our sex, our disabilities, the presence of our children. And almost half a century after the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, we continue to see basic and blatant forms of discrimination, as well as the emergence of a more subtle but equally pernicious variations of that. Racial discrimination, though, for example, is still evident in the rental of apartments. Within the last year, we settled a Fair Housing Act case alleging that the owners of several apartment complexes in Ohio told African American applicants that apartments weren't available, and then turned around and signed new leases to similarly qualified white applicants. The complaint details comments by the owner of the property, including statements that, quote unquote, black people are trouble, and derogatory racial slurs suggesting African Americans cause property values to go down. These actions by landlords cannot and will not be tolerated. Our settlement requires defendants to pay $175,000 to victims identified by the United States, a $25,000 civil penalty, and an additional $650,000 in damages and attorney's fees to private plaintiffs and the state of Ohio. And it went further. The settlement also requires the defendants hire an independent management company to manage all of their rental properties, hire a third party to investigate compliance, receive training on the requirements of the Fair Housing Act, and report back to the department regularly for 3 years. Now, you all know that many potential renters have really no way of knowing that they're being treated differently than their counterparts. And for example, African American applicants may be treated cordially, but would not know that white applicants with the same qualifications would be offered a lower price, see more options, and find an available apartment when they were told that there actually was none. And because of that, the housing providers are too often able to maintain basic forms of discrimination. A predecessor of mine, Tom Perez, called this discrimination with a smile. Through evidence developed by the division's fair housing testing program, however, we can compare the experiences of prospective tenants, gather comments from leasing agents and property managers, and build a case. It is an important tool in our arsenal, and we are always looking to continue to develop new and creative ways to deploy it. We also continue to see governmental entities run afoul of fair housing principles by taking actions to maintain residential segregation. From steering residents to housing complexes based on race, to limiting opportunities to minorities through exclusionary zoning practices. And we filed cases against formerly de jure housing authorities in Georgia and Louisiana, alleging that they continue to segregate residents by race. We have seen municipalities impose moratoria, stopping affordable multifamily housing developments, and change zoning ordinances to achieve the same effect. In St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, a case developed by HUD, the parish even tried to stop private rentals to African Americans by imposing a blood relative requirement on rentals, among other requirements. Private litigation, HUD actions, and a DOJ lawsuit were needed to put an end to those practices and compensate victims. Residency requirements are another mechanism used to perpetuate segregation. We recently sued the town of Oyster Bay on Long Island, an overwhelmingly white community, because when it decided to approve affordable housing developments, it gave preference to its existing residents. Race discrimination is not the only form, of course, of discrimination that we encounter. And within the last few weeks, we've actually achieved settlements in 2 cases alleging familial status discrimination in rental housing. HUD investigated and charged both cases, and we added pattern and practice claims when we filed suit. In both cases, we alleged that property owners and managers implemented policies that restricted children from common areas of the property or required constant supervision for anyone who was under the age of 16. In those 2 cases, we obtained $270,000 in monetary relief and, of course, changes in the discriminatory practices. We continue to see the scourge of sexual harassment in housing. In 3 recent settlements, the allegations were similar. We allege that an owner of property or the property managers engaged in a pattern or practice of sexually harassing female tenants and prospective tenants. And all 3 cases involved horrific conduct. Our complaints allege that the defendants made constant unwanted sexual comments and advances towards their female tenants. They exposed themselves. They requested sexual acts for reduced rents. They delayed evictions or other housing benefits, and they took adverse actions when those sexual overtures were refused. Sadly, many tenants in these properties felt that their only choice was to endure the harassment or be forced to live with their children on the street. But because a few brave women stepped forward and made complaints, we obtained significant relief in these cases, over $4.6 million in monetary damages for the victims. All 3 cases resulted in significant injunctive relief, imposing strict limitations on the property manager's interactions with existing and prospective tenants, as well as requiring employee training, compliance monitoring, and independent managers for the properties at issue. We will continue to aggressively protect the rights of individuals to be free from sexual discrimination in housing. The division has filed 3 more cases alleging unwanted sexual harassment unlawful sexual harassment since November, including United States versus Southeastern Community and Family Services, a pattern or practice case which originated in part from a HUD investigation and referral. And there we allege that staff at a public housing agency actually used their positions to demand sexual favors from female applicants from for the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. Now, access to housing for individuals with disabilities continues to be a priority for the division. In our recent case against the City of New Orleans and the Louisiana State Bond Commission, we allege that the defendants worked to stop the conversion of a former nursing home into permanent supportive housing because it would supply housing for people with disabilities. Under the settlement agreements, the housing development at issue is going forward, and the city has committed to develop 350 additional beds, permanent supportive housing beds, for persons with disabilities over the next 3 years. And at the same time, the city is going to amend its zoning ordinance to make permanent supportive housing a permitted use in all multifamily districts, and will refrain from any future moratorium or the funding of affordable housing in New Orleans. In addition, we filed a total of 9 cases in 2014 alleging a failure to design and construct rental properties to comply with the fair housing accessibility guidelines promulgated by HUD. These cases are part of our department's long-standing efforts to ensure that multifamily dwellings are built with units that are accessible to individuals with disabilities. Homes where someone who uses a wheelchair is not confined to certain rooms. Homes where people who use wheelchairs can leave and enter without assistance or risk of injury. And homes that are integrated into our communities, not relegated to the margins. And to that end, we are also committed to community inclusion for persons with disabilities. The Supreme Court's ruling in Olmstead requires states to eliminate unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities and to ensure that they receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. This is a top priority for the division. Olmstead says separate isn't equal and unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities. We want to end the unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities. Since 2009, the Civil Rights Division has negotiated settlements with 6 states that provide a path for persons confined in large congregate facilities to move them into the community. That's where the Fair Housing Act comes into play. We need to ensure that communities don't impose unnecessary barriers to housing choices available to people leaving those facilities. We are engaged in efforts to resolve claims against 2 municipalities we believe have imposed such unlawful barriers. Through this work, the division is transforming the paradigm of services that are provided to people with disabilities from one of seclusion and exclusion to one that fosters inclusion and community integration. Our efforts at integration, we found, must also address issues of policing if they are to truly be effective. As an example, one of our HUD referrals resulted in a case against the city of San Jacinto, California, where we alleged that the city discriminated against persons with disabilities when it passed an ordinance restricting the operation of group homes and then targeted those homes for enforcement actions. The city's enforcement efforts included an unannounced early morning sweep by city officials and sheriff's deputies, and we settled the case in 2014. Because of its actions, the city will pay more than $750,000 in damages, attorney's fees, and a civil penalty. And as part of the settlement, the city rewrote its zoning code. Similarly, in our investigation of the Antelope Valley stations of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, we found that in response to community opposition to changing racial demographics, the Sheriff's Department and the local housing authority worked together to target enforcement of the Housing Choice Voucher Program against African Americans with the goal of terminating them from the program and pressuring them to move out of Antelope Valley. As our Antelope Valley investigation illustrates, the division is committed to ensuring that policing does not contribute to segregation and is instead a means to promote safety for everyone no matter where they choose to live. I'd like now to turn to the division's efforts to combat discriminatory lending practices. Fair lending continues to be a major priority as well for the division because it's a fundamental part of fair housing. The division focuses on all aspects of potentially discriminatory action by creditors and all forms of lending, including mortgage lending, auto lending, credit card products, and unsecured consumer lending. A major focus of the division's fair lending work, and I know is a focus for HUD as well, has been mortgage lending. And discrimination at the bank can impact a family's ability to acquire housing just as much as discrimination at the leasing office. The housing crisis sparked in 2007 was driven by irresponsible and sometimes fraudulent lending practices. And while the devastation of that crisis was and still is felt nationwide, African American and Hispanic communities bore the brunt of it. I'm proud to say, though, that our response has been strong. Since 2010, the division has settled 18 suits alleging discrimination in mortgage lending, including pricing discrimination, steering, and redlining. And the settlements in Countrywide and Wells Fargo are the largest fair lending settlements in the department's history. So it is important that I just share a little bit of their background today. Fortunately, explaining these 2 cases actually doesn't require too much time. The complaints that we filed were actually quite straightforward. Essentially, if you were African American or Hispanic, you were more likely to be placed in a subprime loan or pay more for your mortgage loan than if you were a white borrower with similar creditworthiness. And that pretty much sums it up. But the impact of that conduct was significant and much more complicated. Our settlements in those cases recognized that victims were hurt far beyond in prices and terms. The victim compensation funds established through the Countrywide and Wells Fargo settlements specifically took into account the resulting harm to individual credit and the effects that could have on a person's ability to find housing, employment, or access to higher education. And countrywide, the bank agreed to pay $335 million for approximately 200,000 victims of discrimination. Wells Fargo paid over $184 million to thousands of victims of steering and pricing discrimination and established a borrower program called CityLift, which provided $50 million in down payment assistance to 9 communities nationwide that were heavily impacted by the housing crisis. As of early 2015, we have distributed to borrowers 91% of the $335 million countrywide settlement fund and 98% of the more than $184 million Wells Fargo settlement fund. And the CityLift program has really been a resounding success. Over 2,600 loans have been made with grants through that program, and with grants in most jurisdictions ranging from $15,000 to $20,000. HUD's response to the housing crisis has been equally strong. HUD's 2013 settlement with Wells Fargo is going to bring in $39 million of investment to 45 communities nationwide. That settlement arose from the National Fair Housing Alliance's complaint alleging that Wells Fargo maintained and marketed its properties in a state of disrepair in predominantly African American, Latino, and non-white communities, compared to predominantly white communities, where these properties were in quote unquote in a materially better condition. Wells Fargo's investments under the settlement are going to help improve housing in minority neighborhoods that have been hard hit by the foreclosure crisis and are going to support home ownership, neighborhood stabilization, property rehabilitation, and housing development. HUD has also done critical work in ensuring that borrowers have equal access to lending through its investigations and settlements addressing redlining, maternity leave-related discrimination, and disability discrimination. Now, the division's enforcement of the Service Members Civil Relief Act is another area that we are increasingly looking at. The SCRA provides protections during the foreclosure process so that members of the armed forces can focus as much of their attention as possible on their military duties without fearing adverse consequences for themselves or their families. It also guarantees that service members reduced interest rates of 6% or lower on loans incurred before entering into military service. And recently, the division announced that nearly 1,000 service members who lost their homes through foreclosures that violated their SCRA rights will be eligible to receive approximately $123 million. So as you can see, this work is alive and well, and we are very busy at our 2 agencies making sure that the Fair Housing Act is a living and breathing document. We have made fair housing and fair lending a priority at the Civil Rights Division. And in fiscal year 2014 alone, the division's Housing and Civil Enforcement section, many of whom are represented here today, filed 34 cases, including 25 cases with pattern or practice claims. Over half of those cases originated here at HUD, either as referrals or through the election process. And during that time, moreover, the housing section obtained settlements totaling over $350 million in monetary relief for victims and affected communities. In all, we obtained 41 consent decrees or favorable judgments in FY 2014. And I'm also proud to report that in the last 5 years, the division has obtained over $1.2 billion in relief for individual borrowers in impacted communities through lending settlements brought under the FHA, the SCRA, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. No partner is more important to our fair housing efforts than the Department of Housing and Urban Development. No partner refers more fair housing cases and provides more support for our enforcement of the law. And our relationship to HUD is integral in finding, investigating, bringing, and resolving some of our most important fair housing suits. Even individual cases referred to us through the HUD election process can become large pattern or practice suits that can help to significantly move the dial in housing. I applaud HUD's efforts to advance fair housing through rulemaking. In 2012, HUD issued the landmark Equal Access Rule, which ensures through its core housing and lending programs that they're open to all eligible persons, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Finally, I must call attention to HUD's proposed rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing. It is important, it's a very important way to ensure that the promises of the Fair Housing Act will continue to be fulfilled by seeking to increase integration, overcome historic patterns of segregation, reduce racial and ethnic concentration of poverty, and reduce illegal disparities by race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, or disability. So look, together we have accomplished so much. So much. But you and I know, all of us know, that we have much, much more work to do. I look forward to our continued partnership and collaboration to identify and root out both new and old forms of discrimination. Through our efforts, we can ensure that fair housing remains a priority and a part of the American way of life, that all individuals who live in this country have access to housing free of discrimination, and that all communities are protected and supported by the promises of the Fair Housing Act. Thank you very much.
Here, let me grab these remarks here. Vanita, I want to thank you so much for those remarks. First of all, it's so great to have you here, but more importantly, it's so great to have you at the Department of Justice. Thank you. And I hope you'll forgive me for sharing your unofficial bio publicly. So we're going to have a little something for Vanita also before we close out, but I want to share a few closing remarks before we go on our way. In preparing closing remarks for today, it occurred to me that our three main speakers were all born after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And I think that's also true of the singer who, Bruce from FHEO, who did a wonderful rendition of the Star Spangled Banner today. And what it tells us is that in so many places today, a new generation of leadership has taken up the fair housing charge. As we celebrate the 47th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and this year, the 50th anniversary of HUD, we find ourselves in a unique place where several generations of civil rights advocates are working side by side to realize the dream that Dr. King so eloquently envisioned. Each brings its perspective, its history, and its wisdom. We all know the mistakes of our past when it comes to housing policy, but together we are charting our future. Together, we are working to make the Fair Housing Act a true memorial to Dr. King and the principles he stood for. And I should add that this room that we are in and the law that we celebrate today are also literally memorials to Senator Edward Brooke, to whom we all said goodbye this past month at the National Cathedral. In sponsoring the Fair Housing Act, Ed Brooke exhorted federal officials not only to stamp out discrimination, but to cease rubber stamping segregation. That was then, this is now. Today, our leadership at all levels of HUD, at Justice, and among our partners nationwide are writing the course. We are bringing the cases, we are investing the dollars to make all neighborhoods safe, livable, and open to people of all backgrounds. We cannot change history, but let's continue to work together to make HUD's next 50 years brighter, so generations who come after us will celebrate the work we did today. Thank you very much. Have a happy Fair Housing Month. Oh, all right. Look what we have here. So we'd like to end with presenting an appreciation, a token of our appreciation to Acting Assistant Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Thank you very much, Vanita. So that concludes our program. Have a great Fair Housing Month. Thank you very much.